Born in Kentucky just 8 months apart, the lives of Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis passed from ordinary to extraordinary. From the influences of their younger days to their family lives, from their political careers to wartime presidents, Rick Tome will present and examine the life shaping events that provide a compelling tale of the triumphs and tragedies of these men. Hello and welcome to a special program, a partnership between the Hagen History Center, the Erie Civil War Roundtable, and the Jefferson Educational Society. I'm Ben Spagan, I'm the Vice President at the JES, and I'm a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. Before we get to a fuller introduction of our presenter and his presentation, a few programmatic reminders. Folks, since this program is first airing live on both the Hagen History Center and JES Facebook page, we're going to work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it in the comments section below. If you're listening to or watching a later broadcast of this program, still send us your questions, your comments to keep this conversation going. And of course, for more information about upcoming JES programs and publications, visit our website, jeserie.org, and be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For more information on the Hagen History Center, please visit eriehistory.org and find them on the social media platforms too. Now, Mr. Rick Tome is a member of the Hagen History Center and is a frequent presenter for the Erie Civil War Roundtable. He's volunteered as a 7th and 8th grade religious education instructor at Our Lady of Peace Parish for the past decade. Tome, a lifelong Erie, Pennsylvania resident, earned his bachelor's degree in general science with a minor in secondary education from Gannon University in 1983. He taught briefly in the Erie, General McLean, and Mill Creek school districts in the 1980s. He spent most of his career at St. Vincent Hospital in patient care and as the initial guest relations coordinator. Now retired, Tome spends time golfing, traveling, reading, and cultivating a passion for the history of the American Civil War. And here we're going to learn about the American Civil War. We're going to focus on Lincoln and Davis and review those triumphs and tragedies with Rick Tome. So without further ado, Rick, over to you.
Okay, Ben, well, thank you very much for having me this evening, and hello to all your viewers. I think we have a very interesting program for you this evening. As you can see on our first slide, we do have Jefferson and Davis. The Triumphs and Tragedies is the name of our program. Our preface here, if you take a look, is that for all the ideological differences that divided these two wartime presidents, you'll find that there are a lot of similarities. There are differences, but a lot of interesting similarities too. And we're going to weigh more heavily this evening on the personal events and the people that were in their lives that really shaped these presidents throughout their lives. So let's begin here with our first slide. We'll start with the early years of Lincoln and Davis, actually. How many of you really know that Lincoln and Davis were both born in Kentucky? We know about Abraham Lincoln born in Kentucky, most of us do, but Davis as well was born in the state of Kentucky. He was born in the very southern regions, not too far above the state of Tennessee, and Lincoln was born about 90 miles away from where Davis was born. So that's pretty remarkable when you think about it. Davis was born on June 3rd, 1808, and Lincoln on February 12th of 1809. So a difference of about 8 months. Davis is about 8 months older. Now, Abraham Lincoln is the son of Thomas and Nancy Hanks Lincoln. Thomas, which was very common back in those days, 1809, he was a farmer, and he was also a pretty good carpenter as well. Now, not many people realize that Abraham Lincoln had an older sister. She was born, Sarah was her name, and born 2 years before, would have put her at 1807. And when Lincoln was born in 1809, it's a funny little tidbit comment, was that he was shown to some of his relatives, little infant Abraham Lincoln. And one of his cousins, Dennis Hanks, took a look at him. And he studied him for a moment. They asked him what he thought about his little baby cousin. Dennis Hanks said, "He's the puniest, cryingest little thing I've ever seen. He won't amount to much." Well, I guess Abraham Lincoln had the last word there as far as amounting to much in the eyes of the entire nation. But we'll look at Davis now, Jefferson Davis. Make a little contrast there with his family, where Lincoln had just his sister Sarah. Davis was the 10th and youngest child of Samuel and Jane Cook Davis. And again, he was born in Kentucky. His father Samuel was a Georgia-born planter, however, who was fought in the Civil War, excuse me, Revolutionary War, and he named his son, his 10th son, after Thomas Jefferson. So that's where we get Jefferson Davis's name. And you can see there we have a gravestone of Jefferson Davis's father. If you look close enough, Samuel Emory Davis, Georgia, and was also let's see, he was a major in the militia in the Revolutionary War. So that was Jefferson Davis's family background. Now we'll switch back to Abraham Lincoln here. He was named after his grandfather. His grandfather was Captain Abraham Lincoln, who also fought in the Revolutionary War. Lincoln's life in that one-room log cabin in Kentucky he described it himself as a very hard scrabble life. They lived in a one-room home, a dirt floor, maybe one window. Things were crowded. Wasn't too exciting and too much fun back in those days for Abraham Lincoln. When he was 4 years old, he was actually kicked in the head by a horse, and Abraham Lincoln went into a coma. They thought he was going to die, but of course he ended up recovering from that. Another incident that happened to him, very young age, was he was saved from drowning by one of his cousins. Imagine if Abraham Lincoln had not survived that, how history would have changed. But one of the biggest events of Abraham Lincoln's youngest life was that his mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, died when he was 9 years old. She died of a sickness known as the milk sick. And what that was that if you had a cow, and that's where you got your milk from, of course, if the cow wandered off and ate a very poisonous plant known as the snake root plant, then that toxin would get into the milk. And it wouldn't harm the cow, but if you milked the cow and drank that milk, you as a human received those toxins, and it made you very sick, and sometimes it was fatal. Unfortunately for Lincoln's mother, Nancy, she died a few days after coming down with that sickness, and that devastated their family. Lincoln was 9, his sister Sarah was 11, and then there was the father, Thomas. The family really went into a bad state. There was no cooking properly, the hygiene was bad, the family was falling apart. So Thomas Lincoln did what he needed to do. He put Abraham and his sister Sarah in the care of some relatives and friends in their little settlement where they lived, and he went off looking for a wife. He was gone for a few weeks, and he returns with Sarah Bush Johnson, who herself was a widow, and he marries her, and she had 3 children of her own. So Abraham Lincoln had 3 step brothers and sisters, along with his sister Sarah. Now, Sarah Bush Johnson, and you see her photo there, that's her later in life. She turned out to be a very caring and encouraging stepmother. She really brought order back into the Lincoln's house. The kids were cleaned up, and the nutrition was good once again. And she encouraged her children to go to school. However, Abraham and Sarah and the other kids, they really only received about 10 months of formal schooling. They would go when they could to a one-room schoolhouse that was quite a distance away, but they would walk there. And the school was termed and known as a blab school. You see the word there, B-L-A-B. Now, what does that mean by a blab school? Well, they had kids of all different ages trying to study and being taught by a single instructor. And so the thought was back then that to help you read, if you were if you would read sort of aloud, kind of to yourself, mumbling to yourself as you read your lessons, that would help you because you were also hearing what you were reading besides just seeing the words. So if you happened into that schoolroom where everybody was reading different things and muttering the words to themselves, it was just one big blah, 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 blah in that schoolroom. So they termed a school like that as a blab school. Well, the Lincoln family moved for a while to the state of Indiana after Kentucky. And then the family moves to Illinois when Abraham Lincoln was about 21 years old. We'll move to the next slide here. Get to the right spot. There we go. Now we'll switch over to Jefferson Davis. What was he doing in his young formative years? Well, his family, the Davis family, they settle into southwestern Mississippi when Jefferson Davis was around age 4. Now remember, he's the youngest of 10, so that's quite a family to move down into Mississippi. They actually moved down in towards the Vicksburg area, close to the Mississippi River. Now, Davis's education was much more extensive than that of Abraham Lincoln's. Davis was sent to finer schools. He went to a school known as the Wilkinson Academy, which was a boarding school for boys near his family's cotton plantation near Vicksburg, Mississippi. He also went to West Point, and you can see that he graduated in 1828. But Davis, ironically, did not want to go to West Point, but his eldest brother, Joseph, he secured a position for Davis to be accepted to West Point, and Davis did not want to disappoint his older brother, Joseph, so he ends up going up to West Point. Well, it seemed to take to him pretty well. He graduates in 1828, and he was ranked 23rd in a class of 33. So he wasn't an outstanding student, but he managed to hold his own, ranking 23 out of 33. Now, the best friend in his class turned out to be a man by the name of Albert Sidney Johnston, and that's whose photo you see there on that slide, Albert Sidney Johnston, who became the highest ranking general at the beginning of the Civil War for the Confederacy. Unfortunately, Davis's good friend Johnston did not survive the war. In fact, he was mortally wounded at the Battle of Shiloh on April 6th, 1862. Just to give you an idea of some of the talent right behind Jefferson Davis at West Point in the class of 1829 was another commanding general of the Confederate Army, Joseph Johnston, who Davis did not get along with, and Robert E. Lee. And we don't need to say too much about Robert E. Lee and his stature, especially for the Confederacy. Early military service. Both Lincoln and Davis, this is a commonality for sure, they both participated, if you want to call it that, into a very brief war, which is really more of a conflict, April through August of 1832. It's called the Black Hawk War. And what the Black Hawk War was that there was a band of Native Americans, perhaps 1,000 of them, and they crossed over the Mississippi River back into the state of Illinois, and they were trying to claim land that they felt was taken from them by the settlers, and they were led by Chief Black Hawk. That's why it was called the Black Hawk War, and that's a photo you see, not a photo, but actually a painting of Chief Black Hawk, what he looked like back in those days. So the settlers in the state of Illinois were very nervous hearing that these Indians were going to come back and try to take their land. So to help calm the nervous settlers, militia units were formed in Illinois, and as well as the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army got involved as well and sent a few of their people out there to combat the Black Hawk led Native Americans. As I said, it really didn't amount to much. There was some skirmishing, but neither Lincoln nor Davis really saw any combat there. Abraham Lincoln was elected the captain of his company. He was very popular among the people there, so they chose Abraham to be the captain. But as I said, he never saw combat. In fact, Lincoln would always joke about his service in the Black Hawk War. He said, "The only blood I shed came from a pack of mosquitoes." So Lincoln's military service really didn't amount to much. However, Davis in the Black Hawk War, because of his commission from West Point, he served as a lieutenant in the U.S. Army in the Black Hawk War, and he served under a man by the name of Colonel Zachary Taylor. Yes, it's that Zachary Taylor who would become General Zachary Taylor in the war with Mexico in 1846 and President Zachary Taylor in 1850. Now, Davis, and that's his photo right there that you see, a much younger photo, he was described as handsome, and he does look pretty good there. Witty, my favorite word of all this, sporty, and altogether captivating. That's our Jefferson Davis back in 1832. Serving under Zachary Taylor was one thing, but he was also a suitor for Zachary Taylor's daughter, Sarah. She was a young woman that he certainly had his eyes on. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Now we get into the issue of lost loves. We have a lot of similarity here between the two. Abraham Lincoln, now living in Illinois, a small town by the name of New Salem. He was 25 years old, and he did various jobs there. He was a surveyor for a while. He helped work in a store, a small little dry goods store that was in New Salem. And here, in those years, he took an interest in a 20-year-old young lady by the name of Anne Rutledge. And I really like that painting there that you see of Lincoln leaning over a counter in the store, and in comes Anne Rutledge. You kind of get the impression that these two would meet up fairly often in this manner. And I think the artist really captured this very well. Both Lincoln and Anne were very compatible, and they were very much at ease together. They could talk on the same level. She was fascinated by him. He was entertaining. He liked to tell stories. He liked to joke and laugh. And he was certainly a physical specimen. He was 6'4", so and gangly. He was hard to miss. And they fell in love. But the problem was that Anne, at the time, was engaged. She was engaged to a man by the name of John McNamar. But John McNamar had left supposedly to go to New York City for business, but Anne had not heard from him in almost a year. So Lincoln wanted to marry Anne Rutledge, and she wanted to be Abraham Lincoln's wife, but she was waiting for what they called back then an honorable breakup of the engagement. Well, while they were waiting for that, the summer of 1835 was a very hot and wet summer in New Salem, and a lot of rain caused the runoff of animal droppings, farm animal droppings, to contaminate people's wells. Well, many in that settlement contracted typhoid fever as a result of the contaminated wells, including Anne Rutledge. On August 25th, 1835, Anne passes away from typhoid, and Lincoln is devastated. This is the first that people really get to witness his depression and his melancholy, as he would always call it. He went into a deep depression. so much so that the people, his friends in New Salem, were very concerned about his welfare. They went as far as hiding his razors, his shaving kit, so that he would not possibly do harm to himself. Lincoln would be visited many, many times over the years from deep depressions of losses in his life. Anne Rutledge, a lot of people do say she was really the true love of Abraham Lincoln. Another commonality or a parallel between the two Civil War presidents that Davis experienced lost in terms of a lost love as well. He resigned his military commission in 1835 and he marries Sarah Taylor. He becomes a planter down in Vicksburg. He was given land by his older brother, Joseph, who had a big plantation. He gave him part of his land. And so he marries Sarah. And within 3 months, just 3 months of marriage in 1835, both Jefferson Davis and Sarah Davis now contract malaria, being near the water in those hot climates. In September of 1835, Sarah dies from malaria. And Davis as well is extremely depressed. He's the love of his life, much like Anne Rutledge with Lincoln, has died. So we have both of them hurting very badly at a very young age, very young adult age. But of course, they recover. And what vehicle do they take to do that after their depression? Well, Lincoln immerses himself into politics. He starts to run. He runs for the state legislature seat in the state of Illinois. He actually ran for it the first time in 1832, and he lost. But he ran for that seat again in 1834, and he won. In fact, he wins that 2-year term 4 times as a state legislator. 3 of those terms occurred after the death of Anne. So it shows that he really did immerse himself into politics, which helped take his mind off of that loss. Davis, down in Mississippi now, he basically goes into seclusion for about a 7-year period after the loss of his bride, Sarah. And he works on establishing his plantation, which he calls Briarfield. And here you have a sketch on the screen there of what that plantation looked like right along the Mississippi River, not far from Vicksburg. He began with 1 slave on his property, slave by the name of James Pemberton. And James Pemberton, over time, became Davis's overseer on the plantation and actually a good friend, which was very unusual for that time, especially that deep into the South. Davis would catch a little bit of flack for that, actually, for being so chummy with a slave. But Pemberton indeed was his friend, his lifelong friend. By 1845, roughly 10 years after the death of Sarah, Davis would own 74 slaves on Briarfield Plantation. So he really built that up quite a bit. Now to their careers. Well, Abraham Lincoln was actually encouraged by Anne Rutledge to think about becoming a lawyer, to take the steps that it would take. And back in those days, Lincoln was a self-taught lawyer. He would borrow books, law books, and he would read them voraciously. And wouldn't it be nice for the lawyers out there today and those in school to become a lawyer to, in about a 2-year period, just kind of self-teach yourself that? But that is indeed what Lincoln did, and such were the times. And he receives his law license in 1836. And to improve his opportunity, because there wasn't that much going on in New Salem, he is encouraged to move to Springfield, Illinois. And he does so in April of 1837. Springfield was the largest city or town that Lincoln had lived in up until that time. And he met many more influential people. There were more lawyers there. He got into a law practice, and it really opened up his world at that point. He was admitted to practice law in what were known as the circuit courts in 1839. Now, for those of you that maybe have heard of the circuit courts but aren't quite sure what that means, well, think back into the 1830s, 1840s, and especially a state like Illinois was still considered the frontier. And there weren't many cities or towns, yet people were scattered all throughout the state, and there would be reasons for court cases to be heard. So when the weather was good, meaning that the roads were passable, usually in the warmer weathered months, a group of lawyers, along with one judge, anyway, at least one judge, they would ride on horseback together and sometimes in buckboard wagons, and they would ride around through the state of Illinois, trying cases in the small towns and boroughs along the way. Now, most of these cases were land disputes or money disputes, sometimes maybe something as horrible as a murder, but they would go from town to town, riding the circuit, trying cases, and then return back home after a period of a few weeks or even a few months. Well, Lincoln decides to dabble into politics once again, and he is elected to Congress, two-year term, in 1846. And he ran under the Whig Party ticket, and he was elected, which would take him to Washington, D.C. Once in a while, anyway. He also ran for a U.S. Senate seat for the state of Illinois, twice, actually, in 1854 and in 1858. But he loses both of those bids for the U.S. Senate. In 1858, that's the most famous time that he ran for the Senate seat. That was when he ran against Stephen Douglas, the Little Giant. And it was those 7 debates, the Stephen Douglas debates, that really put Lincoln in the spotlight in our country. And this next slide here, it's a wonderful painting, very colorful, and I wanted to include that of one of the debates between Lincoln and Douglas. Of course, that's Lincoln standing there tall in the lighter colored jacket and bow tie, and standing behind him in that very familiar and very confident pose is his opponent, Stephen Douglas. And this is really what it looked like. People would come from miles around. It was a very, very entertaining venue, and they moved around the state of Illinois as well, giving these debates. The first person would, they were always, the format seemed to be where the first person who got to speak would speak for a half hour, and then the second person would get up and speak for 1 hour, and then the first person would get back and kind of speak, rebut, if you will, for a half hour. And so those 7 debates were run on that format throughout the state of Illinois. Well, what about Davis's career? Well, he entered politics as well. He was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives on the Democratic ticket in 1848. Now remember, he's living down in Mississippi, but he left Congress to serve in the Mexican War. So he really only served about a year, if that, in Congress to jump into the Mexican War. And because of his West Point degree and his experience, he was chosen to be a colonel of the 1st Mississippi Volunteers in the Mexican War. And he was wounded rather badly at the Battle of Buena Vista. and that ended up knocking him out of the war. He didn't make the war till its end point. He runs and wins a U.S. Senate seat for the state of Mississippi in 1848. And while he's a senator, he actually becomes chairman of the Military Affairs Commission for the United States. He ran unsuccessfully for the governor of Mississippi in 1851. So there was a loss for him. There was a downer after being so successful with just about everything he tried. But then Franklin Pierce, our 14th president, was elected in 1852. And Pierce was impressed with Jefferson Davis to the point that he appointed him a cabinet position, that being the U.S. Secretary of War for the United States in the Pierce administration. So Davis has some chops here. He's really building his resume for sure. And then in 1857, after the Pierce administration, once again, he is elected to the U.S. Senate. It's ironic, though, with Davis being from Mississippi and the country really starting to grow stronger and stronger at odds against each other, the North and South. Davis spoke often from the Senate floor, urging harmony between the North and the South. Imagine that. He didn't want to see the country split. He did not want the South to secede. However, he always maintained the stance that he believed the Constitution gave a state the right to split away if it so chose. So a little bit of almost a contradictory feeling, philosophy of Davis there. Now we'll talk about the ladies involved in the lives of Lincoln and Davis. Of course, future first ladies, they're not married yet. We'll talk about Mary Todd. Mary Todd, very interesting young lady. She was basically out of Lincoln's league, and she was 10 years younger than Abraham Lincoln. She was actually termed in Springfield, Illinois, as the Belle of Springfield society. She had many suitors, including Stephen Douglas himself, the man who would defeat Lincoln in the 1858 Illinois Senate run. She was very well educated. She came from a well-to-do family. She was well-mannered, but she happened to meet Lincoln at a party in Springfield, Illinois, in the year 1840. And Lincoln was watching her from across the room and was very smitten by her. And she was dancing with just a bunch of other young men who all wanted to be suitors of Mary Todd themselves. So Lincoln, tall, gangly, clumsy Abraham Lincoln, his clothes didn't fit well. His hair was always mussed. He could never seem to comb it well enough. It was thick and unruly. He musters up enough courage to ask Mary Todd to dance, and she accepts. Well, you can imagine how that must have gone. Lincoln being 6'4" and huge feet, Mary Todd barely over 6 foot tall. And he said to Mary during the dance, he said that he wanted to dance with her in the worst way. And Mary Todd joked afterwards, and she said, and he did. So Mary Todd meets Abraham Lincoln, and she is interested in him. She sees promise in him, despite many friends and family members trying to dissuade her from seeing him, thinking she could do much, much better than this tall 6'4" clumsy guy. Well, let's talk now about Verena Howell, future First Lady, future wife of Jefferson Davis. Verena's a very interesting lady as well. Verena, and that's her photo there that you can see, a younger photo of her, or I guess it's a photo, maybe a painting. She was born in rural Mississippi. However, she had family roots and northern ties. She had many friends up north. In fact, she went to school. She attended a very good boarding school up in Philadelphia. Her uncle had been the governor of New Jersey, Richard Howe, at one point. So because of these uh, roots in both the North and the South, she often termed herself as a half-breed, having allegiance in both parts of the country. Well, Verena Howell happened to meet Jefferson Davis at a party in Natchez, Mississippi in 1843. And much like Lincoln there, a party happened to bring these two together. Well, eventually, Lincoln and Mary get to know each other better and better to the point where they decide to get married. However, Lincoln starts to have second thoughts about marrying Mary Todd. He realizes her stature and where he stands in the world. And he gets nervous. He feels, I can't support her or give her the lifestyle that she's used to. So what he does is he goes into a depression and he breaks their engagement. How many people knew that? On January 1st, 1841, Abraham Lincoln tells Mary Todd, we're not going to get married. Well, that depression once again concerned Lincoln's friends now in Springfield, Illinois. They kept a watch over him, not sure what he was going to do. Lincoln tried his best to avoid Mary, but it was hard as they had the same friends and the same circle. And Lincoln was practicing law, and it was hard to not run into Mary, but he tried his best for that not to happen. And this was a period of time where Abraham Lincoln was really, I like to say, kind of sitting on a fence. You know, which way is he going to fall? Is he going to fall on the wrong side and go down a bad path? Or is he going to right himself and you know, come to his senses? Well, there was a point in September of 1842 where Lincoln, not thinking like the Lincoln we're used to, actually is challenged to a duel, and he accepts the challenge to a duel. How many people know that? And it almost happened. What precipitated this was that Lincoln wrote some very scandalous comments in a newspaper anonymously about a man by the name of James Shields. And Mr. Shields found out that it was Lincoln, and he was unhappy, and to stand up for his honor, he challenges Abraham Lincoln to a duel. Well, Lincoln accepts, and as the one who was challenged, the rules of dueling allowed Lincoln to choose the weapons. So instead of choosing dueling pistols, which was very common, Lincoln decides on broadswords. Now this can get very, very bad, very ugly, very bloody. Well, they had to meet over in Missouri to duel because dueling was outlawed in the state of Illinois, but not in Missouri. Both sides, Lincoln's friends, a couple of them went along as seconds. James Shields brought a few of his friends over for his seconds for the duel. And while they're getting ready for this to happen, Lincoln peels off and he takes a broadsword. He rolls up the sleeves of his shirt, and just out of anger and frustration, he reaches up high and he starts hacking away with this long broadsword at the low-hanging branches of a tree. But these branches are up there 12, 13 feet high, just hacking away at them. Well, Shields and his handlers are looking at this, and Mr. Shields wasn't much more than 5'4", 5'5" himself, and this behemoth Lincoln is just demonstrating the advantage that he would have. Well, Shields talks to his men talk to Lincoln's men, and everybody ends up coming to their senses, and the duel never actually happened. But he came very close to a deadly duel in 1842, did Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln never talked about it, and whenever it was brought up, he was always very, very embarrassed by that, for how he was and the hole that he seemed to have fallen into back at that time of his life. Well, through mutual friends, Mary and Abraham's friends in Springfield, they are reunited, and Lincoln promises this time to marry Todd, and they did. They married at her sister's home in Springfield on November 4th, 1842. And there you see the photos, which are their wedding photos. This is probably on the left the earliest photo of Abraham Lincoln. Of course, he's not bearded. He's much younger than the Civil War time photos that we usually see. And Mary herself, very, very young as well. It's funny, but there are about 90 some photos that are known of Abraham Lincoln. None of the photos taken of Lincoln was ever with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. These were two separate photos that were just put into an album side by side, but they were not sitting next to each other. Never photographed with his wife. Now we'll talk about the Davises' marriage. There's Jefferson and Verena, probably not long after they were married. Now, Verena Howell's father's business, he was a merchant, was starting to fail. And everybody knew, Verena knew it herself, that marrying Davis, who was becoming a pretty wealthy planter, and he and owned a plantation in a large house, was a financial security ticket for her. However, Davis was age 35. He was quite a bit older than Verena, and she was only 18, as you can see there. But Davis was very smitten by him. And Verena also was taken with Davis when she met him at that party and the few times that they had gotten together since then. In fact, I'm going to read from you what Verena had to say about her impressions of an older Jefferson Davis. She said, "He impresses me as a remarkable kind of man, but of uncertain temper, and has a way of taking for granted that everybody agrees with him, which offends me. Yet he is most agreeable and has a sweet voice and a winning manner of asserting himself." So Verena Davis, despite some of the flaws that she might see in Jefferson Davis, is very much attracted to him. And so they get married on February 26th, 1845. And this, of course, would be Davis's second marriage. So what was married life like for the Lincolns? Well, there's been a lot written that Mary made Lincoln's life a living hell. And there's some truth to that, but I think a lot of that has been overblown as well. Mary could be very stingy, tantrum throwing. She would hold deep grudges when Lincoln would have to go out and away on the circuit court system, being gone for weeks and for months. That put a lot of stress on Mary, and she would sometimes take that out on her husband, Abraham. In the White House, there were chambermaids who claimed that they actually witnessed Mary abuse her husband, throwing things at him, hitting him, and also verbally abusing him. Yet others maintained that the Lincolns were very devoted to one another as well. So you get both sides of the story. I think Mary, though, she could act out when she did quite volatile, which I think added a lot to the stories. But a lot of people said, and I say here in the bottom, Mary's tantrums were but passing storms in a generally sunny marriage. So Yes, there was trouble, but perhaps not quite as much, especially before the Civil War started in 1861. So the Davises, how was married life for them? Well, Davis was very set in his ways. He was a stubborn man and he had his opinions. And he had his opinions about how a wife should defer to her husband. Very old South, very traditional. Keep in mind, he was 17 years older than Verena. So he felt that he had almost a parental as well as a husband type of role over his wife, Verena. But yet, Verena was very strong willed. She was well educated. And she found it hard to put up with this from her husband, Jefferson. She would sometimes push back. She was furious, Verena was, when she was forced to, by Davis, to live with Jefferson Davis's sister and her sister's children while he was away during the Mexican War. She didn't want to do that, but Davis insisted that she go live with his relatives. And so Verena would write letters to Davis while he was away in Mexico, complaining, and Davis got pretty tired of that. He finally wrote back to Verena that she had better shape up, that he wasn't going to put up with this any longer. And in one of his letters, I quoted there, he wrote to her that if she did not shape up and go along with what he wanted her to do, that he was liable to take up temporary stupefaction and vicious associations, which translates to he was going to take to the bottle and drink and visit prostitutes. Well, this got Verena's attention quite a bit when she received that letter. And she wrote Jefferson Davis that she would change her ways, that she would become more of the wife that he expected and she would not push back. And so things kind of calmed down in the early days of their marriage as they reached that conclusion. Excuse me. Now, both Davis and Lincoln had children, and we'll talk about them here. And you could say that having children in a family is a triumph for sure. Lincoln had 4 sons. He had a son by the name of Robert. We're going to move from left to right here with the photos. That's Robert Lincoln. And then the little boy there in the nightshirt, that is Edward, who they called Eddie. He was the second born. And then Willie, who's leaning on that table, Willie Lincoln. He was named William. And then Thomas Lincoln on the end of the right side there, who we all know as Tad Lincoln. He was the youngest. Robert Lincoln's birth was interesting because it occurred, ironically, 9 months to the day of the Lincoln's wedding. He was literally a wedding night baby, if you want to say that. And that caused a little bit of a scandal. People were counting the days and the weeks to make sure everything was legitimate. But it was 9 months to the day of their wedding that their eldest son was born. Lincoln and Mary both loved their children very, very much. It really solidified their family. And when Lincoln would go out on those circuit court rides for weeks and months at a time, he would always say to Mary before he left, "Don't let the blessed fellows forget father." He wanted Mary to always remind them about him and that he would be returning after he was done with his circuit court. Now, there was tragedy, and certainly this happened with one of Lincoln's children, little Eddie, the second one in from the left. He contracts tuberculosis and suffers with it for a period of a few weeks. And on February 1st, 1850, little Eddie Lincoln dies. This once again put Abraham in a deep, deep depression. Mary Lincoln, the same. They were devastated by the loss of their second child. But then 10 months later, after Eddie's death, William Wallace, who we know as Willie Lincoln, he was born. And this acted as a salve, if you will, to the Lincoln's grief, having a brand new baby in the house. So Willie Lincoln came along and helped write all that tragedy for them. Now the Davis children. The Lincolns had 4 children in their family. The Davises, they had 6 children. However, Verena's first 2 pregnancies ended in miscarriage before she gave birth to children. They were in order: Samuel, Margaret, Jefferson Jr., named after his father, Joseph, who was named after Davis's eldest brother, who gave them the land at Briarfield, William, and Winnie. Now, little Winnie Davis, who's the youngest, her name was actually Verena Ann, just like her mother, but they called her Winnie. They nicknamed her Winnie. Perhaps that was so there wouldn't be confusion with the 2 names being the same. They had their tragedy also with an early born child. In fact, their first, Samuel, died of measles at age 2 in 1854. And the Davises were very, very sad, and much like the Lincolns, went into a depression. But because he was at the time their only child, and their sorrow was tempered by the arrival of the next child, which happened to be their first girl, Margaret, born in 1855. In the photo that you see there, that would have to be Margaret there. We don't have all 6 of the Davis children. Of course, Samuel would have died, so there'd be 5. Perhaps one of them is missing for some reason, but Margaret would be the eldest child there. The years before the Civil War for the Davis family were actually very happy years with their children, and where Jefferson Davis was and where Verena was, being a mother of the children. They were quite happy years, but that was, of course, all going to change down the road. Now we'll look at 1861, because this is a very poignant year with things happening in the lives of Lincoln and Davis. Late 1860, South Carolina secedes from the Union. Of course, Lincoln was elected president. I probably should have put that up there too. He was elected in November of 1860. And South Carolina, on December 20th of 1860, decides to be the first state to secede from the Union. And there you have a headline banner from the Charleston Mercury, which many of you have probably seen before. The Union is dissolved. So Lincoln now, in early 1861, is going to have to enter Washington, D.C. For his inauguration. Well, by the time he does that, there are many more states. There were 6 states that seceded by the end of January, and there would be 11 states in all, forming the Confederate States of America. So Lincoln, because his life was threatened on his way to Washington, D.C., especially in the city of Baltimore, he had to switch trains undercover at night. It was a very dangerous time for him. And when he finally arrived safely in Washington, Lincoln meets for the first time James Buchanan, the 15th president, who was in his last days of the Confederacy. Well, it is said that when Lincoln met Buchanan for the first time, he shook his hand and he said, "I'm very happy to meet you, Mr. Buchanan." And Buchanan is purported to have said to Lincoln, "Not as happy as I am to see you." For you see, Buchanan wanted no part of what he knew was coming down the road. Well, Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4th. That was the inauguration day back in that time. We're used to it being January 20th now, but March 4th was inauguration day until FDR. I think it was either his first or his second inauguration. FDR. Then it was changed to what we're used to now, January 20th. And in his inaugural speech, his first inaugural speech, Lincoln implores the South to reconsider seceding from the Union. Remember, by now, many states have already done so. The war hasn't started yet. That's still a month away. But Lincoln's first inaugural address, I just want to read the last part of it because it's beautifully written, and it's so to the point of how Lincoln was feeling, still holding out that the hopes that they would reconsider and rejoin the Union. Lincoln says at the end of his address, he says, we must not be enemies, but friends. The mystic chords of memory from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land will yet again swell the chorus of union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. That's a beautiful, beautiful ending to his inaugural address. And Lincoln is, as I said, holding out that the South will come to its senses, and both sides, the North and the South, will come together once again, that there will not be that great split. But of course, we all know what happened on the 12th of April, 1861, just a few weeks after that beautiful address. Fort Sumter is fired upon by the Confederacy in the Charleston Harbor, and the Civil War from that point begins. Now, Davis, as a U.S. Senator from Mississippi, his state becomes the second state to secede. South Carolina was first, Mississippi was the second on January 9th of 1861. Davis was not happy about that. He ends up resigning, however. He is loyal to his state. He resigns from the U.S. Senate on January 21st, just a couple of weeks, less than a couple of weeks after Mississippi secedes. Davis said at that point that that was the saddest day of his life, resigning from the U.S. Senate and splitting from the United States. He was commissioned then a major general of Mississippi forces. Given all of his experience, West Point being the U.S. Secretary of War, he certainly was qualified for that. And he finally was inaugurated, wasn't elected, but he was chosen really as the president of the Confederacy and inaugurated on February 18th for a 6-year term. Now, Davis was surprised at that, actually, when he learned that he had been chosen to be president of the Confederacy. He was back at Briarfield on his plantation in Mississippi, and he was tending to his rose garden with his wife, Verena. And when the message came to him, he received the message and read it, and Verena said that he had a sick look that came over his face. He really probably didn't want that, but he accepted it as his duty. Well, the Confederate capital then moves to Richmond, Virginia, after it was started briefly, just for a couple of months, in Montgomery, Alabama. And that photo you see there is a photo taken from Davis's inauguration in 1861. Family life in the White House. Well, for the first time in the White House, there were small children. The first time in 20 years, rather, there were small children in the White House. And it was Willie and Tad. And they caused a lot of mischief. They kept the staff at wit's end, ringing call bells at all hours, interrupting meetings and so forth. But yet Lincoln and Mary turned out to be very permissive parents to their boys' antics. They felt that the boys provided relief and levity during the horrible years of the Civil War. Family life in the Confederate White House. Well, the Davises, they actually moved 6 times in 1861. They moved from Montgomery, Alabama, up to Richmond, three or four homes up there before finally settling in to the Confederate White House. Verena and the children, they evacuated to Raleigh, North Carolina at one point because the Union Army in the early stages of the war was getting a little too close for comfort to Richmond, and they were gone for a few months and didn't return until October of 1862. So the family was kind of upheavaled at that point. This is interesting because in February of 1864, they sort of expanded their family. Verena was taking a carriage ride through the streets of Richmond when she sees a mulatto orphan being beaten badly by his guardian. He was only 5 years old. Davis stops the man from doing this and decides to adopt this young boy as a foster child. The boy's name, they call him Jim Limber. And Jim Limber actually lived in the Confederate White House and would become as if like an adopted son that the Davises took in. In February of 1865, the Davis family, though, is forced to flee to safety as the Union Army is getting closer and closer to Richmond. And the Davis family, not Jefferson, but the Verena and the children and Jim Limber, they flee the White House and they never return after February of 1865. Now we have some White House tragedies here. We have a terrible thing that happened to Willie Lincoln in 1862, February. Lincolns are entertaining at a very grand party. But upstairs in their bedrooms, Willie and Tad are burning up with typhoid fever. The Lincolns are very concerned. On February 20th, a few days after this party, Willie Lincoln dies of typhoid. And the Lincolns again are devastated. Mary is inconsolable. Same with Lincoln, going into a deep depression. Lincoln went to one of his secretaries, John Nicolay, and he cried to him, "He's gone, Nicolay. My boy is actually gone." The Davises were also not spared a tragedy in their White House. On April 30th, 1864, it was a day just like every other day. Jefferson Davis often did work a few blocks away at the Customs House in Richmond, and Verena would often take him lunch. And she did this one particular day. When she arrived with Davis's lunch, dreadful news came to the doorstep of the Customs House about their little boy, little Joseph. They quickly rush home. What had happened was little Joseph was climbing on the banister of the outside of the White House, and he falls about 12, 14 feet onto the hard surface, breaks a few bones, but worse, he fractures his skull. He's carried to his room, but Joseph never regained consciousness, and he dies shortly after. Both parents, Jefferson and Verena, like the Lincolns, are devastated at the loss of their little boy in the White House. It is said, and this always gets me, about the distraughtness of how they felt about little Joseph. The screams of a distraught mother, meaning Verena, could be heard throughout the house and onto the street that awful night. Really touches the heart when you hear about that. Well, the first ladies, Mary Lincoln, she always dreamed of being a first lady. She told people that when she was a young girl, and here she is. But she faced constant scrutiny and criticism from people because coming from way out west, we call Springfield, Illinois, way out west in those days, a vulgar Westerner. She was suspected as a rebel spy due to her Kentucky roots, and she actually had relatives who were fighting for the South. This did not go over well with the North. Willie's death, the stress of the war, and even an injury from a carriage accident. She was thrown from a carriage on July 2nd, 1863, during the middle of the Battle of Gettysburg. Only this happened in Washington, D.C. All contributed to Mary's stress and her reactions to what was building up around her. She had very poor coping skills for the tragedy That was the great tragedy that was yet to come. Our First Lady, Verena Davis now. She loved Washington, D.C. when she was up there with Jefferson Davis when he was a senator. She left many close friends behind in Washington, including the Secretary of State for the United States, William Seward, who was a good friend. She had difficult times making friends in Richmond. They too suspected her of being a spy because of her ties to the North. And Verena could not hide her sense of hopelessness for the South. She was pretty upfront saying she never thought the South could win this war. She thought that they were outmanned, outgunned, outmanufactured, the whole bit. So that did not endear her to the South either. Well, the aftermath of the Civil War, obviously the assassination occurred just a few days after General Lee surrendered at Appomattox in 1865, April 9th. Mary, how much more can this woman take, right? She's unwilling to return to Springfield, too many memories there. So she moved from place to place. She wore black the rest of her days for mourning for her assassinated husband. She goes to Europe for a while, takes her son Tad with her. When they get back in 1871, Tad contracts tuberculosis and he dies. Again, a deep, deep depression affecting Mary. Her husband and 3 of her 4 sons are gone. She became so bad and so distraught that in 1865, her now adult son, Robert, her firstborn, actually commits his mother, Mary, for a while to an insane asylum. By 1882, Mary is 63 years old, and she ends up moving finally to Springfield, Illinois, to live with her sister. And she lives her final days locked up, spending all her time in a second-floor bedroom wearing black. It is said that young children would look outside up into the window to see if they could spot this crazy lady that was supposed to have lived and living in that house at the time. And here it was, the former First Lady. She dies, Mary does, on July 16th, 1862. Very sad, sad ending for Mary Todd Lincoln. Robert Lincoln, the only surviving son into adulthood of the Lincolns. Robert is pretty successful. He becomes a lawyer, becomes chairman of the Pullman Company, also Secretary of War under President James Garfield. His last public appearance was at the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial for his father in Washington, D.C. And he dies at the age of 83 in 1926. You can see a photo there of Robert Lincoln on the far left. Of course, that's the big statue inside the Lincoln Memorial in the center. And that's Robert Lincoln talking to a few people there. I think one of those might be William Jennings Bryan on the photo on the far right. That's Robert on the far right, just about 4 years before his death. The Davis family, the aftermath of the Civil War. Well, Jefferson Davis, of course, he flees Richmond as the Union Army comes into it around April 2nd of 1865. He's on the run. He's finally found and arrested in Georgia in May of 1865. He is arrested for treason. He was never tried, actually, and he was imprisoned at Fortress Monroe, Virginia, for nearly 2 years. And there is a sketch of him sitting there with guards constantly watching Jefferson Davis in that small, wasn't really a prison cell, but he was there for 2 years as a prisoner. They finally released him after 2 years, and Davis was bankrupt. He was stripped of his U.S. citizenship. In 1869, however, he takes a position as a president of an insurance company in Memphis. But the 1870s were very tragedy-filled for Jefferson Davis. The death, for instance, of two more of his sons, William and Jefferson Jr. occurred at a young age, one from diphtheria, the other from typhoid. And then finally, fairly destitute, he has with him his daughter Winnie and his wife Verena, a kind widow who owned a Mississippi plantation by the name of Dorsey, opens up her plantation for the Davises for them to live. And so they do live there from 1879 to 1889. When the lady dies, the owner of the plantation, she hands the plantation over to Jefferson Davis. But Davis lives there until 1889, and he succumbs at age 81 to pneumonia. So not a very glorious ending for Jefferson Davis as well. When Davis was arrested by the federal troops in 1865, Jim Limber, the young boy that they had adopted, was taken away from them by the US troops. And Verena sent a note to the people that took him away. Please look after our little protege. They never saw Jim Limber again. Verena, she lived with and cared for Jefferson until Jefferson's death in 1881. And afterwards, and that's a photo of Verena there, very much older, sitting in that chair, she moved to New York City. And she actually wrote articles for a newspaper in New York City, along with Winnie. Winnie also became a bit of an author herself. And Verena lived until the ripe old age of 80, and she died in 1906. So she kind of got back north where she was always fond of. Finally, we'll get to the last two children who survived for the Davis family. Only two out of all of them survived to adulthood. That would be Margaret and Winnie, and that's a photo of the eldest daughter, the second born, Margaret, right there. Margaret was the only Jefferson child to actually marry and raise a family. Margaret died at the age of 54 in 1909. And it is said that her family members, her lineage, there are still some out in the state of Colorado, although I don't know how connected they are to all of this. And then finally, we'll finish here with Winnie. Winnie was their youngest child. She remained single her entire life. And unfortunately, she died at a young age of an infection, I had read, in 1898. And that last photo that you see there is actually a photo that we took when we were in Richmond, Virginia, about a year and a half ago, my wife and I, Hollywood Cemetery. And that's a beautiful cemetery if you ever get a chance to visit it. Two presidents are buried there. George Peckett, Jeb Stuart is also buried there. But Jefferson Davis, Verena, his wife, and Winnie are buried there in Richmond, Virginia at Hollywood Cemetery. So there you have it. I kind of sped things up at the end. I know we're getting short on time, but I wanted to just kind of display for you a different twist to Lincoln and Davis, their young lives and the influences of their lives, much more than just the usual war and politics, that the family played a big role, both when they were young and married, in shaping these two Civil War presidents. So at this point, I guess, Ben, we can leave it up for questions if anybody has any, or
Yeah,
yourself.
So Rick, I'm going to jump in and thank you for that. What a fascinating look at the triumphs and the tragedies of Lincoln and Davis, the things they had in common in terms of their milestones along their life and their life's paths. Fascinating stuff. So thank you, Rick, for that.
Oh, you're welcome.
I also want to welcome into the conversation no stranger to these programs, these partnership programs here with the Erie Civil War Roundtable, the Hagen History Center, and the JES, the executive director of the Hagen History Center. We've got Mr. George Deitch on the line with us as well. Always a pleasure to share the platform with these organizations to be able to host these programs. And George has been a great part of that, a big part of that. So thank you, and the mutual lift for all of this. Rick, I'm going to head to the comment section because we do have some questions there. I'm going to pull
Sure.
those, but I'm going to toss over to George to ask the first question to get us started with a little bit of time we have left here for the questions. George, over to you.
Hi, Rick. Excuse me. Hi,
George.
Rick.
Hello.
On paper, Jefferson Davis was much more experienced to handle the responsibilities of running a government at war.
Right.
What essential character traits would you pinpoint as to his failure to succeed?
Well, that's a good question, George. And you're right. He certainly did have, his resume was much stronger than Abraham Lincoln's. Okay. From the things that I've learned about Davis, his big flaws was that he was very stubborn and he felt that he was always right. And so this unwillingness to bend very often on the advice of other people in government, on some of his generals, didn't help him during the Civil War, being the president of the Confederacy. Verena himself, when she first met him, I don't know if you were here at the time, but she commented when she was only 18 years old, he has a manner about him that he believes that everybody agrees with him, and he sticks with that. And I think that Davis's stubbornness, not listening to people or advice very well, was part of that, the problems that he experienced trying to general that war.
Rick, I think that's a natural place to jump in with an audience question here, because
Sure.
you covered the fascinating aspects of their life and some of their family elements and the people that shaped them around here. But somebody here is wondering just some of the logistics. He does become president of the Confederacy. How does that happen?
How did Davis become?
Yes, how did Davis become president
Okay.
of the Confederate States?
When the states started splitting off, you had the governors of the states. Remember that everything was about the states first and the country second to the states in the South. And the states with their governors and their leaders and very wealthy planters who had a lot of influence, in the South in those days. They basically got together and kind of formed a committee and appointed Davis. He was not elected president of the Confederacy. He was appointed the president, and it was sort of by a committee vote that yes, he'd be the best person to put in there. And again, as George pointed out, his resume pre-war was very, very impressive. Who else but Jefferson Davis in a lot of these people's minds? That's really how he was chosen in that role. And Davis, being a military man and having served as senator and secretary of war, he just felt that it was his duty to accept that appointment.
Thank you for that, Rick. I'm going to head back to the comments section. George, over to you for another question.
Sorry about that. I put myself on mute. At the end of the war, even as he fled, Davis was a diehard, determined to keep the war going. How can you explain the reasons behind the efforts to prolong the war? Clearly, all was lost, and to what end at that point?
Yeah, that's. I think again, George. I think that points just to his stubbornness. I think that he believed that somehow, some way, he would find the way to convince people that we can still do this. There was a quote from him that went against what Robert E. Lee wanted, and thank goodness it didn't happen. Lee didn't want a guerrilla type warfare. Once the South surrendered, it was time to capitulate and become one again and brothers again. Davis was quoted that we will take to the hills. We will fight in smaller pockets, point to point. He said those words to never give up. And so, you know, why? I just think it was his nature, given his experience of all the things that he did, to just keep pushing and keep pushing. And maybe it was arrogance as well, that at some point we'll turn that corner. And when we do, that's when we'll really take off. It was delusional on his part. Absolutely it was. But it's a darn good thing that Robert E. Lee's idea and what he told his men about becoming good citizens again won out, and not Davis's let's keep fighting no matter how many small fronts we need to fight on.
Rick, I'm going to jump in here with a final question as we're almost out of time.
Sure.
What a fascinating way to look at two historical giants in American history that many of us take time to learn about, and all the way from elementary school up through high school and beyond. What drew you to take a look at Lincoln and Davis as you have here, and to catalog such parallels in their life and their development? What drew you to this study?
Well, you know, when you read enough over the years, you do it sort of separately. You know, you read about Abraham Lincoln, and you read about the North, and then you read about the South, and then Jefferson Davis comes into play. And as I read more about these two men individually, it dawned on me that, wow, there are some things that happened in their lives that were kind of similar. And the one thing that really hit me was the loss of their sons in each of their homes, each of their White Houses, Willie Lincoln and then little Joseph Davis. And that really touched me and got me to look into them a little bit further. And I just started picking out, a lot of people pick out, you know, what was different from each. I decided to start looking at what was similar from each, kind of from that standpoint. I think it was those two deaths of those kids were kind of the spark that did that.
And such a fascinating overlay of the two lives of the two men and taking a look at that. So, Mr. Rick Tome, I would love to stay here and ask more and more questions, but we're gonna have to bring you back for another presentation, dive deeper to take a look at more. This has been truly fascinating. We appreciate you sharing your time, your energy, your efforts on this research and sharing it here with us in a partnership event between the Erie Civil War Roundtable, the Hagen History Center, and the JS. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well, it was my pleasure. I had a wonderful time putting this together, and I look forward to this. And yes, let's get together again, Ben, and I hope your viewers enjoyed this as much as I did.
Wonderful. We're getting thanks in the comments section, folks saying it's always a pleasure to learn something new. So they appreciate that from you, Rick. And of course, we appreciate all of you, those viewers tuning in, watching live, either on the JES Facebook page or the Hagen History Center Facebook page.